Kremlin has played down Donald Trump's orders to move two nuclear submarines closer to Russia, saying Moscow did not want to be involved in polemics. Well, in the first official reaction since the U.S. president's comments last Friday, Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov said American submarines were on combat duty anyway and dismissed the idea that there had been an escalation. U.S. President Donald Trump says Special Envoy Steve Witkoff made travel to Russia on Wednesday or Thursday, the final days before his new deadline on Friday.
We've already put out a statement, and the answer is they are in the region, where they have to be.
Is what Steve Witkoff's message will be to the Russians? Is there anything they can do to avoid sanctions at this point?
Yeah, get a deal where people stop getting killed. They had a number that just came out that a tremendous number of Russian soldiers are being killed. And likewise, Ukraine, a lower number, but still thousands and thousands of people. And now we're adding towns where they're being hit by missiles. So it's a lot of people being killed in that ridiculous war. Well, there'll be sanctions, but they seem to be pretty good at avoiding sanctions. You know, they're wily characters, and they're pretty good at avoiding sanctions. So we'll see what happens. But Steve is focused right now on the border in terms of, we're talking about with Gaza, getting people fed. And he may be going, I think next week, Wednesday or Thursday, may be going to Russia. They would like to see him. They've asked that he meet, so we'll see what happens.
Well, for more on this, I'm joined now on the line from London by the International Affairs Analyst, Dr. Marek Laskiewicz. Glad to have you join us, Marek.
Well, yes, thank you very much.
Good. Trump promised to end these wars, particularly the Russia and Ukraine, but is escalating. Why?
The reason is quite simple, that Donald Trump is a good businessman, undoubtedly, but this is politics, and he just doesn't understand that negotiating with Russians is a totally different animal to making business deals. This was his fundamental problem. Now that he's decided to play the more political route, what's happening now is threatening ever more sanctions, but in fact, this is unlikely to do much to deter the Russians, because as I said from day one of the war, sanctions are next to useless with Russia. It is a very big country. Moreover, it has many semi-allies. And so Donald Trump will find it difficult to end the war at any time in the near future.
Now, repeated diplomatic approaches have not yielded the expected results. Instead, Russia answers with its, what you will call his largest air attacks on Ukraine.
Yes. Russia, of course, if you keep reading the media, is apparently on its last legs economically. It's lost many men, can't possibly carry on fighting. Vladimir Putin is very ill. Well, unfortunately, the very opposite appears to be true. Russia has enough soldiers, especially with its allies, has enough arms, and it's in fact able to fight ever more. The key point is whether or not they can take the town of Pokrovsk, which is one very big, important step for them. But as for shelling Ukraine in an attempt to lower morale in Ukraine, which they have succeeded slightly, and ultimately to bring Ukraine to the negotiating table, they have enough arms for that, they have the will for that, and therefore there is no present view to see the end of the war, as there are no terms acceptable to both sides or anywhere near that.
Good. Now, Witkoff, like I read a while ago, is doing Moscow himself. There seems to be a little snag. Witkoff and Trump seem to be saying different things. They seem not to be on the same page as the deadline given by Trump approaches, which is Friday. How difficult is this mission for Witkoff?
Well, unfortunately, it would appear to be fairly difficult for a very simple reason. Why next week, we wonder? Why not this week if it's serious? And the answer is quite clear. The Russians are seeing what exactly Trump is going to do. Now he's pinned his flag to the mast and said this Friday, well, let us see what he does. And the answer would appear to be so far as one can tell, that there's nothing much in the pipeline in concrete terms. There are talks of secondary sanctions. India has been given a warning shot across the bows. But whether Donald Trump is actually going to do anything, and with the Russians, if you're not going to do anything, the rest is just hot air. And therefore, I think the reason why it's going next week is because the Russians are playing for time and seeing just what Donald Trump is going to do or say.
Do you think that Trump is learning the lesson the hard way? There is no more difficult diplomatic task than ending a war. How will this change his approach and paradigm if indeed he's learning anything from this?
I think he is learning because, let us face facts, he has failed in his primary goal. And the reason why he's failed is because, as I said, he approached it as a businessman. And now, as you put it, learning the hard way. This is politics. This is military. Totally different aspects are important. Sure, he dangles in front of Russia the prospect of making money doing business with America. But the Russians aren't money-minded like the Americans. They're not a meretricious culture in this respect. And therefore, this is of absolutely secondary importance to them. And the things they want to hear, he wasn't putting on the table about the fact that Ukraine must be neutral, have no Western arms and armies there, and so on. So therefore, yes, he is learning the hard way. The problem is, having been in office for some time, people are starting to get a measure of the man. Historically, incidentally, the Russians reckon it took 2 years for a president to learn his job. But Trump has been in office before, so it's not a question of 2 years anymore. However, it is quite clear that after a few months, we can see something about him. He talks big, he makes threats, he sometimes does something, withdraws, changes his mind, all of which, when you're dealing with the Russians, is near on fatal for negotiations because they are a very dour, hard, concrete people who want to see exactly what you're offering and negotiate on that, if at all. And the moment you hint you might change your mind, well, they're just going to hang on. I think they're going to probably play Witkoff just play him along because to see whether Trump is going to do anything. Meanwhile, all the time pressing Ukraine, making advances, and seeking for a breakthrough like Pokrovsk.
Marek, have they even really considered a ZOPA? By that I mean zone of possible agreements in negotiations, or are they just rambling along and doing what one could call trial and error?
The Russians have a quite clear goal, and so do the Ukrainians. These goals are, of course, not anywhere close to each other. What America might have done is found some sort of area of compromise. This is, by the way, the word that I have been using. Unfortunately, Donald Trump shot himself in the leg by offering to cede Ukraine from the word go. Crimea, sorry. My mistake. To cede Crimea from the word go. And this was a weakness. This was a mistake. And then he talked about having to cede territory. Well, the moment you speak in those terms, you're making it quite clear Russia is winning. And therefore, Russia is, of course, thinking in terms of the whole of Ukraine to this day, just as Ukraine is thinking of Russia leaving all its territory to this day. And here is where Donald Trump did not actually manage to find this middle ground of any sort.
All right, I don't know what I'm going to call this now, an elephant in the room or a crocodile. What's then your sense of Trump moving nuclear submarines after Medvedev's comment warning of what he called dead hand threat?
Yeah, finally, Donald Trump is now moving in the political sphere as opposed to trying to make a business deal. The reason why he moved the submarines is to show that he means business, that America is powerful. And just 2 submarines, incidentally, that will do. It's not supposed to be a threat. It's supposed to be just a hint, if you like, a message that America has nuclear arms. It is the world's #1 power. And this was brought home to the Russians by this very astute maneuver. And here, this is what Trump should have been doing months ago if he's serious about trying to end the war.
But Russia, too, has got quite some nuclear arsenal.
Quite right. And this is, of course, the danger. Now we're in the sphere that I was saying. for many years that the problem with this war is it may escalate out. It could happen at any moment. The escalation will be initially tactical nukes as opposed to strategics. I foresaw this happening in Poland. That is to say, Poland being the battleground, nuclear battleground. But the point is, as you rightly say, both nations are armed to the teeth. They've got enough nuclear bombs to terminate the world, were they so minded to use them. There really is an enormous explosive power there. And this is the danger. Therefore, Donald Trump quite correctly has stated a move to nuclear subjects for reminding that is not a big threat, so it's not an escalation, but it's there. We've yet to see, and this is the key one, unfortunately, the two subs, although they're useful, they're a minor consequence. We've yet to see what he says and does on Friday. When the deadline runs out, that's when all eyes will be on Donald Trump. If he doesn't pull through, if he doesn't make good some sort of threat, it'll be serious, because the Russians will conclude, because when they spot weakness, they use it, that Donald Trump is simply incapable of doing anything more than posturing.
How would you evaluate Trump so far? Has he failed?
He hasn't succeeded. That doesn't seem to say he has failed. The point is that the war is still contained. It's only in Ukraine. The war is not nuclear. There'll be no non-conventional arms used, admittedly some chemicals by Russia. The Russians have not succeeded in taking more territory on time when he was president. He hasn't failed. But then again, he's nowhere close to success, and it really does hinge upon him making good his word. And here's a problem. We've seen sanctions go up and down like a yo-yo, threats on all sides. 1 minute he wants to occupy Canada, next minute it appears to be off. This is fatal against the Russians. They really you have to have a firm line if you're going to make it at all. And by the way, not every nation has made it against the Russians.
Before I let you go, Marek, what might be done now, not just by Trump, but the world and the warring parties to produce better results over the coming weeks and months?
The key point, according to my analysis, which I published some time ago, there has to be a notion of a compromise both sides don't like. It is possible. A compromise would mean that the war would be stopped, in which case it can't escalate if it's not there. Unfortunately, both sides have got very extreme positions, and there's no sign of their wanting to abandon them. As a result, the only real thing that's going to happen is, assuming Donald Trump doesn't do anything, which I assume is actually going to happen, is that the war reaches some sort of stalemate. Were it to do so, a compromise would appear. Unfortunately, at present, it would appear the Russians are winning, hence the initial commentary made about this huge drone attack, which underlines, if anything, that Russia is there militarily all the time, all the way.
All right, Marek Laskiewicz there. Thank you for being international affairs analyst, for being on The World.